a balloon that was clearly from China. It had Chinese characters on the side of it. Floated into U.S. airspace over Alaska, drifted over Canada, and moved south into the continental United States before working its way out over the ocean in South Carolina, where the United States shot it down. And there's been a big question about what the balloon was doing there. The United States says that it was. United States claims that it was a military balloon from China. I'm not entirely sure I believe that. And China claims that the balloon was entirely civilian, being used for weather research purposes. Not entirely sure I believe that. But the difference matters when it comes to how international law and treaties handle it, right? So if it's a military balloon, then a military balloon of any size, regardless of what its purpose is not allowed to be over U.S. airspace without prior written U.S. permission, right? If it's there, if it's over U.S. airspace and China did not ask to be allowed to have it over U.S. airspace, it is not allowed to be there, and it is totally within the United States international right to shoot it down, regardless of what it's for. If it's a civilian balloon, then there are different rules for if it's allowed to be in U.S. airspace, right? So there are two classifications for balloons specifically, and the rules and what those classifications are based on size, right? So a balloon with a payload of 4 kilograms or less is allowed by an international treaty that the United States agrees to be over U.S. airspace for any reason at any time without prior permission. That's part of the treaty. If it's a civilian balloon, it is allowed to be over U.S. airspace, right? And if sorry. Driving the bus poorly here. We're gonna have to put a little edit in here when this makes it out to the tubes of you. I've got my microphone set on the wrong setting. I think I'm blowing out this thing. Does that look better? Hey, that's a little better. All right. Okay, so if a balloon is less than 4 kilograms, then it is allowed over U.S. airspace for any reason, as long as it's for civilian applications. This is a treaty that the United States has signed, right? We concede to all countries the ability to put a civilian, a truly used for civilian purposes balloon of less than 4 kilograms over the United States at any time for any reason, right? But it has to be, strictly speaking, less than 4 kilograms and for civilian use only. The balloon that China sent over the United States was claimed to be for civilian purposes, which checks off one of those boxes, and it was claimed that it accidentally flew over the United States, right? And the reason why they have to put accidentally is because this balloon was actually the size of a car. It was like almost bus sized, so way heavier than 4 kilograms, way bigger. So by international treaty, China was supposed to ask the U.S. for permission to place this balloon in U.S. airspace, and China is saying that they didn't originally plan for the balloon to take the path that it took, which is why they didn't ask for permission for it to be over the United States. Now, so their argument hinges upon it was a civilian balloon, but it was too big. But because we didn't know where it was going to go, we assumed it was going to go somewhere else, not over U.S. airspace. Therefore, we didn't notify the U.S. and everything is fine, and the United States shooting it down is a gross overreaction to what's happening. Right? So, the United States claims, on the other hand, that this balloon was there for surveillance. It was floating over the United States to pick up the United States. It was over the United States to pick up potentially radio signals, maybe take some photos, like intercept communications. Maybe they're not entirely sure what it was there for, because the United States hasn't released any of their findings from the wreckage because they haven't found it all yet. They've only found a little bit of electronics, and they've only found a little bit of electronics and then some wires and the actual balloon itself. The rest of the apparatus that was attached to it is still at the bottom of the ocean. It's not a very shallow. It's not a very deep water. It was only six miles off the coast of South Carolina. So they're currently searching in a one square mile area to find it. So I'm assuming we'll know some more stuff later. But the United States has a reason to report it as defense for shooting it down because that absolves the United States government from the condition that you don't shoot down a civilian balloon, right? Now, it's still too large to be over United States airspace, but it would have had to have been placed there on purpose by the Chinese to justify the United States shooting it down by international treaty. And the Chinese are claiming that they didn't put it there intentionally and it was civilians. So the United States has to claim that it was it was a military balloon and they shot it down for defense. Otherwise, the United States is violating an international treaty that they've agreed to. And China has to report it as civilian because if they don't, they've admitted to doing something that they shouldn't have done by the international treaty. And then the United States is perfectly within their right to shoot it down. So both countries have an interest in stretching the truth to justify their actions. You know, it's probably, given the capabilities of the Chinese space program and the espionage program that the Chinese have, a balloon being over the United States is a pretty clumsy way to gain surveillance. So it's not a particularly good way to do surveillance in the United States. It's pretty obvious. It's slow moving. They can't control it. The United States can basically do whatever the hell they want with it once it's in U.S. airspace. So it's a pretty clumsy way to do surveillance for military action. So I'm inclined to believe that if it was militaristic, it was there for some other motive, right? But the United States must claim that, and given it came from the Chinese government, it's possible that they're fudging things in its capabilities. So they set it up for civilian use, but the civilian use that it was originally built for also has military applications, and as such, they can sort of like fudge the line a little bit. So it's the truth of what's going on with this balloon is probably somewhere in the middle. It was probably a civilian balloon. It was probably a civilian balloon originally, where that the Chinese, being the Chinese government, sort of like was like, hey, you know, this data you're picking up, we can kind of use it for military applications, so give it to us. Because the Chinese government doesn't ask, they tell you what to do. If they're interested in what you're doing, they will tell you what to do. That's how it works in China. Right? They pretty much leave businesses alone for all intents and purposes and let them operate like a Western privatized business until that business has something that the government wants, and then you shut up and give the Chinese government what they want. So I think the truth of the matter for the Chinese balloon is that it's somewhere in the middle, right? Now, the wild thing is this was not the first Chinese balloon to drift over the United States. It was just the first one that was shot down. There are reports of. We'll go over to here. There are reports of four other times that the balloons were tracked, that were found over U.S. airspace, but they weren't identified until well after they were long gone, right? So the question becomes, why did the United States attack this balloon, and why did they not attack any of the other balloons? What was the reason they left the other four that are known alone? And it says here, according to U.S. officials, Chinese balloons crossed over the U.S. at least 3 times during the Trump administration and at least one other time earlier in the Biden administration. However, the U.S. was not aware of the Chinese incursions at the time, according to Air Force General Glenn Van Herk, the head of NORAD and the officer responsible for domestic air threats. He told a news conference that the military only learned of the intrusions after they were pieced together by the intelligence community after they happened. As the NORAD commander, it's my responsibility to detect threats to North America. I will tell you that we did not detect those threats, and that's a domain awareness gap that we have to figure out. The intel community, after the fact, made us aware of those balloons that were previously approaching North America or transited North America. U.S. officials have not said precisely when or where those balloons incursions took place or how the intelligence community was able to discover them in retrospect. U.S. officials say the incursions were brief, unlike the most recent one, which lasted for a week. Representative Michael Waltz, Florida Republican, said defense officials identified the locations of the previous balloon incursions when briefing lawmakers over the weekend. The Washington Post reported the locations included Texas, Florida, Hawaii, and Guam. The Biden administration say they've offered to brief senior officials in the Trump administration about the incursions that took place during Donald Trump's time in office. Okay, so basically what that means is they found the balloons in the data from NORAD's radar systems, right? They found it later, which happens a lot in scientific research. You know, that we don't find planets by pointing a telescope and seeing a planet. We find planets by taking massive amounts of data and running them through a bunch of computers to crunch the numbers, and then the computer spits out, hey, this might be a planet. And then we go look and check, right? So the same sort of thing happened here. The NORAD collected a bunch of data, a bunch of radar signatures from things here or there, and it didn't trip off their initial detection. And then later, the intelligence community combing through the data went, "Hey, these look kind of like balloons here," and so it exposed a blind spot in NORAD's ability to detect things, right? So, let's talk about the recent. There are 3 more objects that were shot down since the Chinese balloon was shot down that are a bit more obscure in what they are. We know what the Chinese balloon was, right? We know what that was. So, but there were other ones that happened, right? We have 3 other objects. One over Lake Huron. The object was around 20,000 feet, soaring near the eastern portion of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was shot down over Lake Huron, about 15 nautical miles east of the Upper Peninsula. It presented as an octagonal structure with strings hanging off, but no discernible payload, senior Biden administration official said. We did not assess it to be a kinetic military threat or anything on the ground, but assess it was a safety flight hazard and threat due to its potential surveillance capability. So basically, they determined that it was not a bomb, a rocket or a ballistic missile or some kind of other sort of weapon, right? That's what they mean by it did not assess it to be a kinetic military threat. They mean that it's not going to hit the ground and do any damage. Let's see. Another one over Yukon, Canada, approximately 40,000 feet in Canada's central Yukon. After crossing the border from Alaska, the shoot-down took place around 100 miles from the U.S.-Canada line. Early indicators showed this object is potentially similar to the one shot down off the South Carolina coast, or the Chinese balloon, right? Canadian Defense Minister added that it was smaller in size and cylindrical. The object had unlawfully entered Canadian airspace and posed a reasonable threat to the safety of civilian flight, right? So one of the justifications is this thing floating in the air could get hit by a plane, right? Because lots of planes are just flying predetermined paths. They assume there's nothing in the way because it's the sky, right? What's in the way in the sky? Once you get above the flight altitude of birds, like what else is up there? You know what I mean? No plane's looking for a balloon at 40,000 feet. So that's their justification for shooting down these things that are unknown, right? Their justification for shooting down the Chinese balloon was it was for military applications, but these ones here, they don't even know what they are yet. So they're just being like, yeah, we're just going to shoot it down because, a plane might collide into it, which would be a problem. And then another one off the Alaskan coast. It was at 40,000 feet over Prudhoe Bay along Alaska's northern coast. The object was about the size of a small car. Ryder told reporters, adding that it was not similar in size or shape to the high altitude surveillance balloon from the previous weekend. Posed a reasonable safety threat or threat of safety to civilian flight. And recovery activities are occurring on sea ice, as allowed by Arctic weather, limited daylight, and conditions. Yeah, because it's dark for a long time right now in Alaska, so it being on sea ice means it's kind of hard to get to. So they're working on it. They're working on getting to that one. Okay, so there's a section in here. So let's talk about why the the four objects that were shot down in the last couple of weeks, right? Why those were detected and shot down, and the four that were detected from Trump's administration and earlier in Biden's administration were not shot down or detected, right? And the answer is right here. It says the U.S. had been on alert to look for spy balloons and unauthorized objects since a Chinese balloon caused national sensation and political outrage. That incident, Dalton said, helped the U.S. learn about what to look for detect. Puh, Jesus, that was. I got tongue-tied as hell there. What the Jesus? Anyway, Dalton said also helped the U.S. learn more about what to look for in detecting similar objects. That process includes adjusting radar filtering systems known as gates. You can set various gates to filter radar information, Van Herk said. We call them velocity gates that allow us to filter out low-speed clutter. A lot more information is available, the general said, when lower speeds are included rather than filtered out. We have adjusted some of those gates to give us better fidelity on seeing smaller objects. You can also filter out by altitude. And so with some adjustments, we've been able to get a better categorization of radar tracks now. And that's why I think you're seeing these overall. So that's what I was saying before, right? They were collecting all of the data, just like they do when they're hunting for planets, right? But the algorithms and the computer programs that are analyzing all that data are only looking for certain things initially, right? It'll only trigger a warning if it's looking for certain things. Because if you're trying to say figure out whether an object is an approaching enemy plane or like just a giant flock of birds, you need to be able to like discern between those two. And your program can't trip and claim incoming enemy planes when it's just a giant flock of birds traveling across the ground. So you have to be able to set parameters so you don't get false detections, right? And their floor for detections was set too high, right? They weren't accounting for slow moving, smaller sized objects. They were looking for fast moving plane sized objects. And these balloons are not that big and they also move a lot slower. So they got filtered out in the data. But the raw data still existed, and the intelligence community was combing through it later and was like, hey, this doesn't look like a flock of birds here. This looks like something else, right? So that's how that happens. So there's been some questions about whether or not these unidentified flying objects, the three that were shot down after the Chinese balloon, if they were aliens, right? And the generals and people who are in positions that may have some information on this are inclined to say nothing about it until they know something otherwise, and until the Pentagon and the intelligence community has gotten their story straight, because they've dealt with this in the past where people speak off the cuff about stuff and then it turns into a sensationalized story. That's very similar to what happened at like Roswell. People said some stuff initially that they weren't supposed to say, and then it fueled a bunch of speculation. And I'm not trying to say whether or not anything that happened at Roswell is true. I'm just saying that nobody knows what happened, and speculation was fueled by the fact that people who were in the know at the time said some stuff initially that they weren't sure about, and it sort of messed everything up in the short term. So now they just don't say anything until they get their stuff together. And so that's what happened. one of the generals was asked directly about whether or not they thought it was a UFO, and he basically was like, "I have no information for you." He didn't, or sorry, extraterrestrials. Asked if it was extraterrestrials, and he was like, "I have no information for you." So he didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it, which a lot of people are taking as like almost an admission that it might be extraterrestrials. But if you look at the history of the way, um, if you look at the history of the way the government reacts to this stuff now, post like Roswell, post 9/11 era, post all that stuff, they mostly just stick to their guns about, we don't have any information for you until we tell you we have information for you. So it doesn't actually mean anything, right? And on top of that, um, let's talk for a second, because physics is one of my side hobbies. I don't do it professionally, and I'm garbage at the math, but I pride myself on trying to learn some concepts, right? Let's talk about why it's probably not aliens. And the main reason is the speed of light is very fast. It's real fast, like dumb fast. And at cosmic scales, though, at the distance between the stars, it's real slow. But there's this nice little quirk of physics where the speed of light is not just the speed of light, it's the maximum speed anything in the universe can travel at any given time. You cannot interact with another piece of the universe faster than the speed of light. If you try to approach the speed of light, it takes more and more and more energy to reach the speed of light, to the point where no matter how light the mass is, no matter how insignificant the amount of mass you're trying to accelerate is, it will take infinite energy to reach the speed of light. This is not a negotiable piece of physics. This is just an observable fact that we have, right? One of the most powerful machines on Earth, the LHC, accelerates individual particles which have indiscernible mass. You cannot even measure it without doing some really kooky experiments, right? So light, and it uses the same electricity of like a small city, and it cannot accelerate these things up to the speed of light. So this is not negotiable. It is a hard speed limit that nothing we have ever observed or theorized has been able to break. Right? So, as a result of this, it's highly unlikely, given our current physics, that aliens have made it to Earth. If they're not somewhere within, like, say, 10 light years or so, it's highly unlikely, given physics works the same everywhere, that they would end up coming to Earth. It's a unbelievably insurmountable task. Like, unbelievably hard to do that. So I'm fully on board with there being aliens out there. The universe is huge. Like, it's just statistically basically as certain as you can get that there's going to be aliens somewhere in the universe. But I find it highly unlikely, given what I know, that aliens would make it to Earth. But let's entertain the idea that maybe it is aliens, right? Maybe there's something we don't know. There's something I haven't learned. There's something we as a species just have not discovered yet that allows travel through the stars to be a reasonable thing to do, right? Why in the shit would a civilization advanced enough to travel the stars just let the United States shoot their objects right out of the sky with a Sidewinder? Right? That is such primitive technology compared to what they could do, that, like, it is incredibly hubristic of humans to think that we could just point the first weapon we would use in our arsenal at their ship or drone or whatever and shoot it out of the sky. Like, that, the hubris that would take is insane, right? It's basically almost a logical fallacy to just guess that we could do that. And as such, I really don't think it's aliens. I think it's probably more, research things or weather balloons, especially from China, because they've got a habit of, China has a habit of doing things in the civilian space that interacts with the international community and then just not telling them about it. Their rocket that they send to space, right? Everybody else in the world, when they launch a rocket, the booster stage falls back to Earth in a controlled manner. They have a target that it's supposed to hit. The United States usually drops it in the Pacific, right, if possible, or it'll drop it in the Atlantic. It depends on the trajectory, right? China's booster is entirely uncontrolled on its reentry. So a couple of years ago, there was a random there was a random booster just falling back to Earth that nobody even knew about. And when the international community was like, "Yo, who launched this?" China was like, "Oh yeah, by the way, we launched a booster, and it's going to fall somewhere over Russia. We don't actually know where it's going to hit because we didn't. Our rockets can't control their descent into the Earth's atmosphere." And the international community was like, "Well, that would have been nice of you to tell us, you know." So China has a history of doing things that are completely innocuous. Launching a rocket to space is a country's right. We do it all the time. It's not a scary thing, right? It's not necessarily a bad militaristic sort of act to do it. We do it all the time. Communication satellites, Starlink, astronauts going to the space station, yada yada yada, right? And China now has their own space station and their own astronauts. And so they have a history of not telling us stuff. So that's what I would bet it is just more Chinese, maybe Russian, possibly maybe even Israeli, although I doubt the United States wouldn't know about an Israeli thing. Perhaps even Indian. The Indian government is friendly with the United States, but not that friendly. So it's totally possible that these things floating through our airspace, right, are just stuff other countries didn't tell us about. They don't even necessarily have to be military. They could just be standard civilian weather balloons or stuff, and they just didn't tell us. Because once you launch a balloon, you can't control them all that well, right? They have to be light enough to float on the air, and as a result of that, their ability to steer themselves is limited by the wind that they're in. You can steer them, but not that well. So it's perfectly possible for balloons to end up completely off course, depending on how the winds go. So, yeah, I don't think it's a big deal. I mean, everybody's making a stink over like the Chinese having this balloon over the United States, or maybe it's aliens, or why is there this giant hole in our ability to pick up threats? Right? There's all that stuff happening. And I'm just over here looking at it from the outside going like, maybe it has military applications. It's probably civilian. The Chinese have a habit of not telling us stuff. The United States is currently under tensions between China over Taiwan, so maybe they saw an opportunity to like do a show of force or like prove that the United States is serious about resisting China. And then maybe China's pulling some sort of long game about seeing if the United States would react to something that they did. I mean, who knows? But regardless, it doesn't seem to me like this balloon was doing anything that we even needed to worry about, because again, it's a balloon. The Chinese have satellites. Satellites can do what the balloon can do. The only reason you would need a balloon specifically is if you were trying to collect some data about that particular column of air that it was floating in, which would be a weather balloon, which is what China said it was. Now, the weather balloon may have military applications. Maybe they pick up a radio, maybe they put a radio receiver on it, and they're trying to pick up U.S. military, conversations back and forth. Maybe they're trying to float it between the transmission points of some communication satellites. Maybe that's what they're doing. I mean, it's possible, but it's just not. It doesn't seem like it's worth all this hullabaloo. I'm not saying that the United States shouldn't have shot it down. Like it violated international treaty, and it was a Chinese-made object. Yeah, sure, shoot it down, whatever. I don't care about that. I just don't understand why it's suddenly become such a big deal. It seems so minor to me, But yeah,